So tonight's week 3. It's going to be the 5th lecture now. And this one is going to be on exercise design and war game design and how they go hand in hand. We're going to go over 3 separate styles of war games. Keeping in line with the rest of the lectures, it's going to be a pretty brief overview, and your assignment isn't due till next Tuesday, which we'll talk about later. But it'll be on you to kind of do some more research similar to that first assignment, kind of dive in and see which structure you think might work best for you. But the intent is to go over different ways that you could structure a war game and why you might choose one way over the other, some of their strengths and weaknesses. So, again, tonight we're going to be going over these 3 in a very, very brief way. But I've given you kind of like the acronym. So a staff X is just a quick way to say staff exercise. There's also a type of word game or exercise called a Plan X, which is just a planning exercise. They're very similar in nature, but usually if you just hear X on the end of something or in the beginning, so like XCon in wargaming terms, that's exercise control. So X usually stands for X or exercise. TDG, it's a tactical decision game. This is going to be at the lowest level of a war game. If any of you are familiar with some of the stories from the Battle of Fallujah and how they were using a tabletop game called Advanced Squad Leader at the time to kind of practice how they might do some urban ops and war game that would be an example of a tactical decision game. Where it's basically a scenario or a vignette laid out in front of you. You're given all of the information about your position, your forces. Usually they are very military centric, although you could adapt a tactical decision game to multiple different uses, and we'll kind of go over that further. And then the last one is going to be a tabletop double blind game. Not really going to have too many examples of it, just because as I explain what it is, it's kind of self-explanatory. And when we played Littoral Commander, if you remember how units would be concealed and people had asked questions about on the tabletop version, are you able to see your opponent's cards all the time and know how much ammunition they have and how much health? So that would not be a double blind game, but if you set up folders in front of all that information so each team couldn't see, that would be considered a double blind game. So it's very easy to set up. So staff exercise, I'm going to go over what it is to me in wargaming terms, how I might use it, and then we'll go over the pros and cons or the strengths and weaknesses of it, at least from the things that I've seen. So staff exercise is basically a war game, and you could use any game really, but the easiest way to kind of look at it is it's a cooperative war game where the players aren't necessarily playing the game, meaning if you're using a digital game like Combat Mission or Flashpoint Campaigns or any of those kinds of strategy games, you'll be using the game as a tool to adjudicate the combat or the actions that the teams are making. So, for instance, if I was to set up a staff exercise, what it might look like if we were to do one with this class right now is I would split half the class into a blue cell or a blue team, and I would split the other half of the class into a red cell or a red team if this was a head to head game. And then I might say, hey, we're going to use game X for this, um, but you're never going to touch it. You might see it if I give it to you as screenshots or a recording of what happened, just for some narrative and some visualization. But generally speaking, what happens is you would conduct a staff exercise to keep the participants engaged in reality and what's going on in real life. Because you don't want somebody trying to game the game. They might know the game you're using a little bit better, or they might do things that aren't realistic to life because the game isn't punishing you for it. I know a lot of us who play strategy games are probably used to losing thousands and thousands of men and women in our war games when we lose a brigade or lose a division. It's a lot harder to make that decision when you're not thinking it's a video game and you're in the constraints and kind of this environment where everything is real life to you. You're writing real orders according to whatever branch or service you're associated with, and how they want you to write them. Everything you're doing would be in real life, and then you would simply. So if we were going to use combat mission, and I wanted to get a blue and a red game going, I would ask blue to tell me what your first moves would be, or what your course of action is. So let's say you were a platoon, blue's a platoon, and red's an insurgent force inside of a building. If this was a staff exercise on a tactical level, you might talk amongst yourselves and assign different roles and positions to the blue team to look at different aspects of the problem. That way, you're all hyper focused or compartmentalized on a very specific aspect of the problem, and then you come together with your combined information that you've got to formulate a plan together as a team or as a staff. And because you're not really ever seeing the software or the tabletop game being used, excuse me, you're just thinking about real life. You're thinking about real tactics or what you would do in that situation, not what you can do because the game is allowing you to. Some of the strengths of having a staff exercise is realistic scenario testing. So, because you're keeping everybody in the constraints of real life, it's very easy to write a staff exercise down on a piece of paper, verbatim, 1-to-1 to what a actual battle happened, and put somebody in that situation to see, okay, what kinds of decisions will they make and how does that pair up to what actually happened. Or you could use a staff exercise for a future force concept, or how might we fight this problem in the future, things of that nature. So they basically just allow you to keep the students or the participants engaged in real life, being able to create realistic scenarios that aren't exactly gamified by the software or the war game you're using. And they can also provide some pretty cool insights to how players think, not necessarily how strategies and plans might play out in the real world. Um, I put that in there because a lot of what happens is you'll see players in most of the staff exercises forget that they're playing a video game or that a video game's even involved, and they'll start, churning those realism gears. And as that happens, you just hear some really unique discussions happen, or if you're doing it through text based, you might be lurking in the channel and watch as the teams are discussing. And there's some diverse backgrounds that happen, and everybody has their own piece of the puzzle to put together. Um, and sometimes you do see some creative ideas start to pop out of that. So the second point, team building, kind of piggybacking off that first point, because nobody's really playing a game. Even though it is a war game, they're not actually hands on with anything. It promotes discussion because discussion is the only way that anything gets done. You can't just rely on one person to kind of click the mouse or move the counters around for you. The team pretty much has to pull their own weight together in order to perform. So if you would imagine, let's say we're doing a staff exercise for the South China Sea, and we have an air component, a naval component, and maybe a stratcom fires component or something like that. All those components would need to talk to each other before they could even begin to plan on their individual levels, because how's the maritime component going to conduct their mission if they don't even know what the air component's going to do? So team building just kind of happens organically out of a staff exercise. Decision making skills. So your participants can develop and hone their decision making skills under pressure, which is valuable in multiple different facets of life, whether it's military, business, athletics, even. And so basically, what this means is usually in a staff exercise, the one thing that you'll hear a lot if you're running it and not participating, or if you're participating, is you'll always feel like you need more information. You will never feel like you have enough information, and you will constantly feel like you're missing that one key piece before you can finally say, okay, this is the target I'm going to strike, or this is the plan that we should do. And Nine times out of 10, that's on purpose. And it's to try to force these decision making skills. So not everything's going to be perfect in the real world, whether it's in business or a combat zone. Um, and so basically, you're trying to not necessarily test people and say, hey, you made the right or wrong decision, but get people comfortable with just making a decision with less than perfect information. Because a lot of times, I'm guilty of it myself. A lot of times when we play war games, we try to wait and think 7 moves in advance. And in order to do that, we need every piece of the puzzle to come together. And sometimes you're just never going to get that. And so a staff exercise really forces people to make a decision collectively, and arguments should happen internally within the team because that means people are worried about separate problems and they have different ideas on how to solve it. And that's kind of where the decision making skills come into play is you get to hear different viewpoints and people making decisions on the fly. Learning opportunities. So there's a little bit of cross training that happens in staff exercises, maybe not formally, but for instance, at Marine Corps University, we can't control, the background of the people that participate in our war games. So when we do a staff exercise war game, or if you do a staff exercise war game that's open facing to the public and you just let anybody register, you can't control the background. So a lot of times what will happen is you might have an infantry officer who's in charge of an air component, or a cyber person in charge of a maritime component, or just generally speaking, they're never going to really be in charge of anything that um, that's applicable to their job in real life. So what tends to happen is you'll have members on the staff for each of these teams that do have that knowledge kind of chime in and pitch in and help, help inform to make better decisions. And so, just naturally through that, there's learning opportunities that happen, whether it's civilians who don't know anything about, how to basically build a strike package for a ground target, or whether it's a military professional who doesn't know anything about logistics. There will be organic conversations that happen as part of a staff exercise, where as long as people are listening, they will gain knowledge from various different fields. And then feedback and improvement, because almost everything is done in written form with a staff exercise, it's all recorded. If you're using a digital war game for a staff exercise, you could record the screen for playback later and kind of look at what were the key points in the war game, or what happened. But the feedback and improvement is basically that's more for the professional military education side, for orders writing and what part of their planning process they may have skipped or not done as well as they should have. But it is a way, staff exercises, because everything's written, there's a lot of documentation to go back and read through and kind of critique and see, what were people's thought processes, what should they have been thinking about, things of that nature. Some of the detriments to running a staff exercise is it's resource intensive. So because the participants are not hands-on usually with the war game, all of their information is being fed through documents, PowerPoint slides, screenshots of the AO, or the area of operations. Um, so if you're going to run a staff exercise, you just need to be prepared that it's going to cost, a lot of your time. It's going to cost a lot of your effort. And depending on how fancy you want to make it, if you, let's say you don't have an organization that has the ability to print out maps and things like that, you may end up spending some of your own money depending on how high quality you want to go. But generally speaking, a staff exercise has a team of people behind it helping run it. You've usually got somebody designing the scenario. They've got somebody building the intel products for the teams. They've got somebody building the, battle books for the teams that show what all their equipment is. So just know if you're going to run a staff exercise, depending on how many players and how big of the scope, it is a pretty time intensive. Complexity. So this kind of touches back on, having people not familiar with certain aspects of a war game So going back to this first slide and one of the strengths, these learning opportunities with the cross training. One of the, I guess it is a double-edged sword, because let's say you have participants that sign up for staff exercise and they don't know anything about military operations. Let's just say it's military focused for this example. They might be pretty lost as to what's expected of them, what's required of them, depending on how formal you want to be about what they need to submit to you for orders. So generally speaking, because of this, it can be a little overwhelming for new people, especially if you don't identify who those people are ahead of time and try to pair them inside of a component. So what I like to do, for instance, is um, let's say we have some people sign up that say, hey, I don't have any experience, no wargaming experience, no staff exercise experience, nothing. What I'll do is I'll put them on a staff, but I won't put them in a critical role. I'll put them somewhere where, um, the person in charge of that component generally knows what they're doing and they can pull the team through if they need to. That way, that person can still get experience, they can still get involved. But if they get overwhelmed, it's not going to slow down the game and it's not going to make them feel bad about it, right? Because at the end of the day, we want people to come back to our war games. Risk of misinterpretation. So this happens a lot. It's kind of hard to prevent. All you can really do is kind of just take the feedback as it comes to you and then make better products next time. But generally what this means is, as it says, there's a risk that participants may misinterpret the objectives or rules of the exercise, leading to less meaningful results. So basically what that means is whatever you don't put down on that piece of paper, it's not implied. Do not assume that your participants will understand what is expected of them if you do not write it verbatim. Don't assume that they won't launch nuclear weapons if you don't tell them that they can't explicitly. Things like that. And so because of that, there might be some points in the war game where I'm guilty of it too. I've ran a war game before where somebody was under the impression that they could do something and then 4 turns later wanted to do it and they weren't actually allowed to do it, and it kind of resulted in not a bad time. Like, they got through it, they understood, they had a good time, but you just want to avoid those friction points as much as you can. And so again, because everything for a staff exercise is coming through products that you're building in written form or picture form, you just want to make sure that you spend a lot of time double checking, okay, if I'm going to tell them what the objectives are, I need to make sure that this is what it is. And then the last part is time consuming. Again, kind of just piggybacks off the first one. It's a lot of time, but not just for you. It is a lot of time for the participants. If you want to get anything out of a staff exercise, you need to be prepared to have the participants spend probably about 4 hours. As 4 hours will get you through about 2 or 3 turns, depending on how big of a scenario it is. And then here's an example of some of the products that you might see for a staff exercise. These I would not recommend to use for a formal game. If you're going to run something for like a community outside of work or something like that, this would kind of be the quality I would go for. So on the very left, you can see we just have a basic operations order. It's not perfect, but again, just trying to keep it in that theme of keeping them engaged in a real life setting. It's much better to give them something that looks real than it is to give them a screenshot of a video game or a map on a board, which you could do. But again, just trying to keep them engaged into real life. Then the next picture is a sample of an order of battle, just written in basically a component form, so a joint task force form. And this is just a very basic example of how you could show somebody, okay, this is what you'll have in the war game, even though you'll never see it. This is how you could tell somebody, okay, this is what equipment you have, and this is what kind of munitions they have. And then the last one is kind of an example of a battle book you could make. This is actually a poor example because it is a screenshot from the video game, but I was kind of short for time. So it is an example of something you can do. But what I would recommend is try to find real life photos, kind of what you see there. And then instead of telling them what the stats are in the game, just go back and try to. I wouldn't give them actual technical specifications. I would translate that into uh, something meaningful to the players that you'll understand. So you might separate an aircraft into three categories: first generation, second generation, third generation, right? And then you might just say, okay, this is a level one aircraft for first generation. That way you know what it means, they know what it means, and it's simple. We're going to try to go a little bit faster just to keep it within the 8 o'clock mark because I know some of you are overseas. So, tactical decision game. A tactical decision game can be anything, honestly, but generally speaking, you might identify them as if you've ever seen articles, from back in the Cold War times or 1990s, or they still come out now. They're just not as popular. But it's usually a scenario. They can be hypothetical, but a lot of them are historical. It's a military scenario on a tactical level. So you might have a platoon, like I said, a platoon that needs to take that house. And just much like a staff exercise, it will be all written as if it's real life. It won't be written in the context of a software you're using or a tabletop you're using. And so if I was to create a TDG for a squad trying to take a house, I might write it as, okay, this is Alpha Squad of, this platoon of this company, and this is the situation. You took fire from the second floor of this house, and you kind of get the idea. You would write it in real life. You would attach a picture of a map to kind of give them an overview of the situation so they have a visualization of what they're seeing to go along with the details. And then you could do it in a couple different ways. You can run tactical decision games where, let's say, I had a scenario ready to go. I might explain to you all what the scenario is, show you a picture, and say, okay, you have 30 minutes. Tell me what you'll do. And that's what a tactical decision game is at its most basic form. Is it's a rapid fire, quick decision game on a tactical level. So you're looking at a very specific problem. And it's not necessarily, again, about you being right or wrong. It's about you making a decision with the information you have. They can be timed, where again, you might only have 30 minutes and tell me what to do. That's usually in a classroom setting, for like enlisted personnel, or you might have officers that do it. Um, or you might have an untimed one. So you might say, you might have a TDG like the Marine Corps Association puts out where they say, okay, mail us in your responses, and you have a month to do so. That way you have time to kind of think through it, discuss with your peers, swap answers, see that's what the tactical decision game is supposed to be. That's what it used to be. That's what some people are trying to kind of update it and make it now. But I mean, that's a tactical decision game basically. Is you just come up with a scenario. It's a discussion usually. There's usually not some kind of software or tabletop game you're doing, though you could use it, like that advanced squad leader example I had mentioned. But it's not a staff exercise in the sense that it's not this long, drawn out thing where you're releasing additional products. You can if you want to, but it's not really required. It's an individual submission usually. So some of the strengths of running a TDG is decision making practice. So because it is that, usually it's a small, quick, fun scenario to do where you can get multiple in. Um, you get those practical decision making practice, and it allows people to kind of get better at the same problem over time because you might give them the same assault to conduct, but you just might change the variables a bit. And so you're still getting your reps and sets in. Realism, because you can do it through written form and it doesn't require an actual software or a tabletop game to use. You could keep the scenarios fairly based in realism. Um, and everything you're talking about can be true to life instead of, oh, I only have this available in this game because they don't have the newest version or whatever. Cost effective. So compared to larger staff exercises and simulations, TDGs can be more cost effective to run, requiring fewer resources in less time. And that's as easy as basically in simplest terms saying if you wanted to run a TDG course for your organization or your unit, it would be very easy for you to come up with 6 TDGs in advance and then release them one a month without you really having to do anything because they're already pre-built. So this is very much, if you want to think of like military terms, this is like a shoulder-fired AT4. Just fire and forget, just drop it on the ground once you make it. If you want to have touch points and discussions throughout the period while a TDG is ongoing, you could certainly do that. It's really up to you how you structure it. So flexible TDGs can be adapted to suit different skill levels and training objectives, making them flexible and versatile training tools. Basically what this means is because it's a TDG, you can adapt it to whatever problem you want. You're not limited to, like I said, because the software can't do ground combat or it can't do air combat. A TDG is basically you come up with an idea, you look at the problem, you ask for answers, you evaluate, and then you discuss. And so if you're talking to midshipmen or second lieutenants, you might make a TDG on a platoon level. If you're talking to a company commander who's a captain, you might make a TDG on a company level. And so it's a very just versatile system. It's not confined to like you have to do this and this for it to be a TDG. And then immediate feedback. Again, it kind of goes off of the StaffX exercise example is because everything's in written form. If you wanted to, if you didn't want to wait and somebody submits you a course of action for the TDG, you could immediately, just give them feedback. If you're using a game or some type of tool to adjudicate what people are telling you or to evaluate, let's say you have a program that you want to use to test their plan, you could, do it through Discord with them. You could record it. You could give them a visual feedback so they can actually see the consequences of their plan. Some of the cons or weaknesses of TDGs is limited scope. So because they typically focus on that specific tactical scenario problem, 9 times out of 10, they don't capture any of the outside concerns. You could build those in. Then you're starting to wander a little away from the TDG kind of structure. So an example of this would be, okay, I am Alpha Squad of 1st Platoon, and I need to take that house by any means possible. But I might not care about how much ammo I have, or when resupply is coming, or whether or not the Navy and the sea gets blasted away and I can no longer get off this island if I need to, right? Like, it's just not going to capture all of the other things that are going on because it is a very tactical and specific problem that you're looking at. That's not what the focus of the game is. It could be if you wanted to look at logistics, you might want to put some variables in there to make somebody think about their course of action. But again, that's up to you. This is just an example of, most of the time it doesn't capture those outside considerations that might actually change the outcome of what you might do. So skill level requirements, kind of going back to the staff exercise. It's not as bad with the tactical decision game, but it can still be a factor. So, as an example, if you have no idea what any of the SOPs or battle drills are or anything about combat arms of any nation, you might have a hard time just jumping into a tactical decision game that's about, hey, make a fires plan for me for this mortar pit. Just because it does require a deeper level of knowledge sometimes about the problem than what somebody off the street might have. You might actually have to do some research depending on the complexity of the TDG. Like if somebody asked me to make a fires plan, for M777 battery against a battalion tactical group. I can make markers on a map, based on what I think, but I couldn't explain it to you. Um, like it's just not my wheelhouse. It's not my knowledge. So I would even have a tough time doing that. I would have to have an instructor guide me through it, essentially. And then the last two are very similar, but they're just a little bit nuanced. So subjective evaluation, depending on who is judging the courses of action, um, it could be subjective. So if you're not using a software or a tabletop game as the model to adjudicate any of these plans for the TDG, then you're going to have to do it through discussion. And you're going to have to pick somebody to have the final say on what would happen. And then basically it's subjective at that point because you're going to have to trust that the person has experience in that specific problem and knows what they're doing in that specific problem. And then the last piece of it is even if they have the first two, things don't always go according to plan. So there's it's kind of hard to basically say for certainty like yes you succeed or yes you fail, which kind of goes back to our first week, which is war games aren't supposed to tell you that yes this is the plan or no this isn't the plan. It's just so you can explore ideas and get better at thinking. And then potential for bias, it's the same thing as subjective evaluation. It's just kind of like on the complete opposite side. You depending on who the judge is, which there's no specific instance that I can recall, but we're all human. There might be some bias depending on somebody who doesn't believe that air defense can be that successful when it might be, things of that nature. And then this is actually a picture of combat mission. So this is an example of how you might be able to create a tactical decision game within a virtual environment using a digital war game. So there's multiple ways. You could either facilitate this live and have somebody tell you what they want you to do for an educational thing, or you can release that TDG in written form, and then basically use any kind of visualization, like combat mission or command or whatever you want to use to basically play that plan out and then record it. And then if those products that you're using have like data analysis export, like Combat Mission Pro, which is why I like to use it for TDGs, then you can basically export that data. And so now you don't just have that subjective evaluation and potential bias, you also have data that you can just say, okay, we don't know that this is right or wrong, but here's the data. And it's better than just having somebody say yes and trusting them. So if you want to use digital war games for TDGs, I would suggest trying to find one that has the ability to either export data that you can use for a discussion point or find a way to track that yourself. Otherwise, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. And then our last example here, tabletop double-blind game. So essentially, if you think back to those of you who were here when we played Littoral Commander, or anybody who's ever played a board game in your life, the easiest way to think about a tabletop double-blind game is that neither side can see each other's information. So if you were playing Littoral Commander, we could all see each other's counters, blue and red. In a double-blind game, blue wouldn't be able to see red's counters and red wouldn't be able to see blue's counters. So you would essentially only see your own forces. And what would happen in a double-blind game is until you actually make contact with the enemy or the opposing team, that's when the pieces start to appear. Or let's say you have a intelligence collection mechanic in your game and you want to implement that. Say, okay, blue and red, pick your areas that you want to abstract, right? Like make believe this is where the satellites would look, or this is where the aircraft would be for recon. And then based on whether they're correct or not, then you as the facilitator of the war game could kind of, at your own discretion say, okay, this is what I want to this is what I want to reveal, this is what I don't want to, or this might be a little bit more realistic. It still gives you the ability to let the players choose and have some agency while you're adding an additional mechanic, but it keeps the integrity of the double blind game. while also allowing you as the umpire to basically still say yes or no as a final say. So some of the pros of having a double blind game is going back to the realism. So if you think, if any of you have played Hearts of Iron or any kind of military strategy game, and you're able to see, your opponent's forces all across the map, everything they have, um, a double blind game gets rid of that and it keeps it a little bit more realistic. So you only have vision of what you would realistically have vision of. So it kind of changes the dynamics of when your players are deciding what moves to make. They're going to make drastically different moves than if they can see a counter that's on the map. Even if they don't know what that counter is, they still know that something is there. So double blind war games can simulate the fog of war more accurately, as players must make decisions based on incomplete and uncertain information. Strategic depth. So I want to think of this as strategic in the scale, going back a week. So it's not strategic in the scale of war game strategic, but it's just talking about having a extra level of depth to what the players are thinking about. And it also kind of goes back to the realism. So they have to use sophisticated strategies and tactics to anticipate and counter unknown enemy movements, adding depth to the gameplay. So going back to Fog of War, you know, protecting your flanks. That's kind of like basic 101 warfare. I think most people have at least heard the term flank before. Um, it has you thinking about protecting your flanks because you don't know what's out there. The fog of war is scary. You don't know what's out there until you can actually get vision. So it keeps players, you know, still contained in realism a little bit more, thinking about protecting the integrity of their formation or their fighting force as a whole. Fairness, so double blind war games can be more fair. That just kind of goes back to if you think when we were playing Littoral Commander and we could see each other's unit trackers. Thankfully, everybody was real casual about it and we didn't have anyone trying to play for keeps. But you could see, what every DDG's health was at, how many intercepts they had left, how many munitions. A double blind game just kind of gets rid of that, keeps it more fair. You don't know how many missiles the enemy has left. Surprise element, so it's kind of still going off of bullet point 1 and 2, but surprise is a little bit different in the sense that when things do happen that aren't anticipated for your players, it will do one of two things. It will either inspire them to think harder and really get into the weeds of the war game so that they can either get revenge or make sure it doesn't happen again. Right? Those are the two things that we usually see. Or, which probably shouldn't be a pro, but depending on just how much of a hard time somebody's having with the war game, it might demotivate them too. So you might consider that when you're running a tabletop double blind game. Depends whether you're doing it for education, whether you're doing it for competitive fun or analysis, really. Goes back to why you're doing the war game. And then educational value, basically a summary of all the other previous points. Because nobody really has that perfect information, it kind of challenges them about, okay, how much do you know about Chinese, hypersonic capabilities? How much do you know about DF-21s? Even if you don't know where the DF-21 is, you should at least know that they have it, and you should have a rough idea of where they can hit you at. And so those are kind of the educational outcomes that happen in double blind games. Is people tend to lose ships and lose things in places where they didn't think they would, and then when they go to research the actual, range rings or, how far can these things actually shoot, it gets them to actually learn about the capabilities. And then some of the cons, they're kind of universal, honestly. Just this one isn't as much in intensity, I would say, when you're compared to like the staff exercise. For complexity, it's really just complex in the sense that if you're going to run a double blind game tabletop, you need to figure out a good system to not only keep the players from seeing each other's stuff, but also make sure that you can run the game smoothly. So for some of these bigger tabletop war games that have a huge map, you might not be able to have everybody in the same room and keep it double blind. You might have to split them into separate rooms with two separate maps and keep it double blind. Or, split half the room down and, put a curtain in the middle or something. However, you need to figure it out, but it needs to achieve both. You need to be able to run it smoothly while also keeping the integrity of the double blind game. Time consuming because it's double blind. It is a little bit more time consuming than the other styles because if you, as a facilitator, forget what that counter is that's face down, you're going to have to pick it up and look at it. And the more counters that are on that board, the more stuff you're probably going to forget. And so it is a little bit more time consuming. And then potential for frustration kind of goes back to the surprise element that I was talking about. You need to make sure that when you run a double blind game that it is the right style of game for the learning outcomes you're trying to achieve, essentially. So if I was going to do a educational war game and I wanted to do a double blind game, I would probably make sure that depending on what the learning outcomes, what I would end up doing is I would give them that ISR mechanic that I was talking about, or I would give them freebies based on what would just generally happen in real life anyways. That way they're still getting drip fed information and they can make decisions and they feel like they're still getting information without just being completely blindsided. That might probably be the way that I would do it. And that is it for tonight.